Guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Val and welcome to day 5 of our 200 days of Psalms. Today's Psalm is actually Psalms chapter 5, where we see David come to God to depend on God for his strength and joy, like when he would face his enemies and his adversaries. And it was more of a prayer that he would make in the morning every day, and he made sure that he would spend time with God in the morning before he would go on with his day, and he depended on God to guide him and give him strength throughout the day. And so let's get into it. You see, David kept repeating, "Oh Lord, hear me, oh Lord, listen to me." So that means that David knew that every time he would cry out to God, every time that he would reach out to God, that God would hear him and that God would answer him. And this was because he was constantly having this devotion, his own devotion time with God. He would constantly have this morning. It talks about in the morning, like David depended on God in terms of before he even started his day, he would constantly have a prayer time with God. I believe it's very important for us to have these consistent devotion times in the morning, especially in the morning, because we're able to command our day and to just have God take over. We saw that with David. He knew that in the morning he would have this consistent devotion time with God, and because he would want God to order his steps throughout the day. So it's important for us as well to always have a consistent devotion time with God, for he's the one who orders our day and to actually command our day. We also see David demonstrated that before he would actually pray in the morning, before he would meditate on God's word in the morning, the Bible talks about he would look up to heaven, and that means that he had expectations from God. Sometimes you go in the presence of God without expectations, and that's why we are always the same. Nothing is changing. So we really need to get to a point where before we even pray, as I'm saying, that we need to have this consistent time in the morning with God, we also have to have expectations, because you can't go in the presence of God without expectations and just expecting him to do exceedingly above that which you expect of him to do. And we saw David having expectations for heaven to open for him, and the heavens would actually open for him because he would have expectations. And we see in verse 4, David was actually meditating on God's righteousness, because he talked about he was aware that God doesn't take pleasure in the ways of the wicked, and because of him knowing that, he would constantly seek and plead to God for mercy, for God's mercies. And because he knew that his mercies were sure, despite him sinning, despite him walking in unrighteousness sometimes, he would constantly continue to plead with God for him to forgive him and for him to show him mercy, because he knew God as a merciful God. I believe we need to get to a point where we understand the mercies of God in our lives, that he's a merciful God and he's ready to show us mercy, but until we ask for mercy, he can never show it to us. Until we ask for some things, he can never give them to us. And in this case, it is actually asking God for mercy, and until we ask God for mercy, he can never give it to us. He's up in, I think it was Psalms 2, where we learned that God is actually looking down on us, seeing whether to show wrath to us or whether to show us mercy. So it's really a choice that God has given us. And sometimes we can actually get so much in our heads that we think we are too sinful not to ask for mercy, because we're in our head and our minds are very powerful. And we saw David, like, despite his sinful nature, he still pleaded with God for mercy. He still knew that God would show him mercy. He still considered God as a merciful God, and because of that, he didn't let his worship to God become emotional. And sometimes because of this sinful nature that in our minds, we turn, because we are not clean before God, of course we cannot go to God like that, so we avoid worshiping God. And for David, he never worshipped God with his emotions, and with that, it will lead you to worshiping God with your emotions, because you're like, me, I feel like I'm not right with God. So David never worshipped God with his emotions, because he feared him, and because he feared God, he continued pleading for mercy despite sinning over and over again. We really need to get to a point where we fear God, and because we fear God, we don't worship him with our emotions. We never, and even the verse that talks about, if you don't worship me, the stones will worship me. Like, we need to get to a point, like, God does not even need our worship. It's just for us that we are meant to constantly worship him. So we need to get to a point where we fear God and we ask for mercy because of our sinful nature. For us being human beings, we're just sinful like that. We need to ask God to show us mercy, and before we even get in the presence of worshiping God, because it's just right to plead for mercy before you get into the presence of God. David also mentioned to God that these enemies of his, these people who are against him, they were unfaithful in their mouth, and like they were against him, they would backbite him. And this thing was kind of bothering. It looked like he was bothering David. And sometimes we're always focusing on how people who are against us, people who are bad mouthing us, we're always focusing on that. But we see in Matthew where it talks about out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks. We need to get to a point where, as David did, you need to not focus on these people who talk bad about you, but to mention it to God and leave it there, and just know that He will take care of it, and stop than actually keeping on focusing on people who don't like you. There are many people who like you more than people who don't actually like you. This is such an assurance that favor surrounds us when we actually considered righteous by God, and we actually depend and trust on God. So my prayer is that we may find this favor of trusting in God and walking in righteousness. And thank you so much for watching. This is just Psalms chapter 5. I will see you tomorrow, and God bless you so much. Thank you so much for watching, and bye.